Every country has a border, every city has its own lining. But the most dangerous border on the world isn't guarded by soldiers or barbed wire. It's an invisible line that separates people who matter from the people who are disposable. It's a boundary of institutional neglect. And if you live on the wrong side of it, you can be killed by a crime before a single drop of blood is ever spilled. In the 1980s, a group of wealthy doctors decided to close up shop at their private radiotherapy clinic in central Brazil. They packed up their expensive equipment, locked the front doors, and moved their practice into a richer, safer part of the town. But they left one specific heavy cylinder behind in the rubble. They knew it contained a high, volatile, lethal medical waste, but the property was wrapped up in an administrative lawsuit. The state of bureaucracy was moving slow, and securing the building would cost too much money. So they simply just walked away. They left a deadly weapon sitting in an empty lot right next to a low-income, working-class neighborhood. To the legal system, this was just an unresolved real estate dispute, a file gathering dust on a desk. But to the scavengers living nearby, the building was survival. Two men broke in looking for scrap metal to sell for food. They found the cylinder and cracked it open, and unknowingly leashed a silent, invisible fire into their community. Within weeks, people's hair fell out, their skin rotted to the bone, their internal organs started failing. The entire neighborhood was glowing in the dark, poisoned by Cesium-137. When the mainstream media talks about Goiânia, they call it a freak nuclear accident, a bizarre tragedy born of poor people's ignorance. But they're looking at the wrong file. The ignorance doesn't belong to the scavengers. The criminal neglect belongs to the elites. The weapons weren't just radioactive capsules. It was a corporate system that treats lives of the poor as collateral damage for profit. This is a story of the Goiânia anomaly, an invisible execution. Salutations, everyone. I'm the author and the founder of the Blxck Archive, a true crime podcast that forces us to look at all crimes, but especially those living in the dead center of a system. Not the one in the total dark, where they're completely buried, and not the ones covered by mainstream media sensation. We look right in the middle, where the files are public record, yet the deepest, most unsettling truths are simply not highlighted. To truly understand our legal system, its blind spots, and obviously its failures, we have to examine a broad spectrum of cases. We look at everything from dark historical mysteries to graphic, devastating crimes, where systematic loopholes become a killer's first line of defense. Today, the killer isn't a person hiding in the shadows. The killer is a bureaucracy that chose to look the other way. On this show, we treat crime as a political report card. Because when a system is corrupt by institutional apathy, a weapon doesn't have to be a knife or a gun. Sometimes it is a lethal corporate waste left abandoned in a poor neighborhood, wrapped in an administrative shrug. Today we're taking you to Brazil. In 1987, mainstream media often frames what happens as a bizarre freak medical anomaly, a glowing blue powder that accidentally radiated an entire community. But when you look right at the dead center of the public records, you find a story of criminal state neglect, abandoned regulations, and wealthy medical elites who walked away while innocents paid with their lives. Last week, we looked at how the political system fails women. Today, we're looking at how the very same system protects corrupt banks over human lives. Welcome back to the Blxck Archive. The teletherapy unit was manufactured by an American company in the 1970s and imported to South America. At the time, Western countries routinely sold older nuclear medical equipment to developing nations with weaker regularity frameworks, effectively treating Global South as a dumping ground for hazardous technology. This adds a massive layer of neocolonialism and international exploitation. You can argue that crime didn't start in Goiânia in 1987. It started a decade earlier, when Western corporations exported nuclear liberties to nations where they knew they didn't have the equipment needed to monitor them safely. Let's establish the geography and the timeline of this file. The city in Brazil, it is the capital of Goiás State, a bustling metropolitan area. But like many South American cities, it is heavily segregated. You have pockets of extreme wealth, and right next to them, communities of extreme poverty, where people survive entirely on recycling the trash of the rich. The crime happened in the month of September 1987. To understand why this happened, we have to look back at 1985. A private medical clinic called IGR decided to move to a brand new facility. They packed up, but they left behind an obsolete teletherapy unit used for cancer treatment. Inside the machine was a heavy lead-shielded capsule containing roughly around 93 grams of highly radioactive cesium chloride. Okay, so now under international law and Brazilian nuclear regulations, you can't just leave a radioactive weapon sitting in an abandoned building. The clinic owners were legally required to notify the National Nuclear Energy Commission and then safely dispose of it. But they didn't. Instead, they got into a bitter, multi-year court battle with local society over who owned the land. While wealthy men argued over real estate values in courtrooms, the building sat half demolished, rotten, and completely unguarded. The clinic owners even tried to warn the state of the dangerous device sitting right there, but the local court appointed a security guard who rarely showed up. The system allowed a literal dirt bomb component to sit in downtown Goiânia like a piece of disposable furniture. On September 13, 1897, two local scavengers, Roberto dos Santos Alves and Wagner Mota Pereira, walked into the unguarded lot. They were looking for scraps of metal to sell for food. They saw this heavy, shining steel and lead assembly. They had no formal education and didn't know what radioactive symbols meant. They loaded the heavy unit into a wheelbarrow and wheeled it home to Roberto's backyard. That night, the symptoms started. Both men began vomiting violently. They experienced severe diarrhea, and their hands began to swell. They went to a local clinic, but because they were poor men from a bad neighborhood, the doctors didn't run complex tests. They dismissed it as food poisoning from something they might have eaten out of the trash, gave them some medicine, and sent them home. 5 days later, on September 18th, Roberto managed to crack open the lead capsule with a screwdriver. He poured the contents out. What he saw fascinated him. It was a compressed salt that glowed with a deep, surreal, luminescent blue light in the dark. Thinking he had found something magical or incredibly valuable, Roberto sold the remaining fragments to the local scrapyard owner named Devar Elves Ferreira. For the next 10 days, Devar's scrapyard became a house of wonders. He invited neighborhoods, friends, and family to come see this glowing powder. He distributed pieces of it as a gift. Brother Ivo scraped some of the dust off the floor and brought it home. He spilled it on the kitchen table, and his 6-year-old daughter was at that exact table eating a sandwich. Her fingers were covered in the glowing dust. She fascinatedly rubbed them all over her skin like glitter. She ingested the sesame directly into her bloodstream while eating her lunch. By late September, an entire neighborhood was silently decomposing. People were collapsing in the streets. Their skin was blistering, turning black, and peeling off in sheets. Still, the local hospitals misdiagnosed them with tropical disease or food allergies. The turning point didn't come from a government health inspector or a nuclear agency tracking an anomaly. It came from a woman. Devera's wife, Gabriela Maria Ferreira, noticed everyone who had come near that glowing powder was falling violently ill. Her own health was deteriorating. Sensing a terrifying connection that professional doctors had missed, she put the remaining pieces of the capsule into a plastic bag, boarded a crowded public bus, and took it into the hospital. Think about the raw courage of the act. She carried a highly radioactive core on a public transport bus because she knew the system wasn't coming to save them. Finally arrived at the radiation counter, the machine's needle maxed out instantly. Authorities realized with absolute horror that a massive radiological emergency had been active in the middle of a major city for 2 weeks. The response was chaotic and brutal. The government turned a local soccer stadium into a mass quarantine camp. Over 12,000 citizens were forced to line up in the heat to be scanned for radiation. 249 people were found to be heavily contaminated. 4 people died agonizing deaths within weeks. Mila Ribeiro and Fernando Pereira, 2 young scrapyard workers who helped dismantle the machine. Gabriela Maria Ferreira, her internal organs failed from severe internal bleeding. Lade das Neves Ferreira, the 6-year-old girl. By the time she was hospitalized, her white blood cell count was non-existent. She suffered internal hemorrhage throughout her lungs and kidneys. When she died, the local population was extremely panicked and deeply propagandized by the media. That broke a riot out at her funeral. Thousands of citizens threw rocks and bricks at her coffin, trying to prevent her body from being buried in their local cemetery. Ultimately, she had to be buried in a custom 3-ton lead coffin, encased in heavy concrete, just so she could rest in peace. When the disaster broke, state-controlled and mainstream media outlets focused heavily on how the scavengers stole the machine and ignorantly played with its power. They painted the victims as uneducated criminals who brought a tragedy upon themselves. This is a classic political tactic called victim blaming to shield the state. By making the public focus on the scavengers' lack of education, the government successfully deflected the attention away from the fact the state itself had failed to secure a weapon-grade radiological capsule for over 2 years. They blamed the poor for not knowing what radiation was, while protecting the elites who knew exactly what it was and chose to abandon it. Now let's peel back the layers of this tragedy and look at the cold, calculating political callous that followed. Because this is where the legal system proved exactly how much they did not care. When the dust settled, the state had to clean up the mess. They demolished entire houses, scraped topsoil off the earth, and packed up 3,000 cubic meters of radioactive waste, which is now buried at the outskirts of the city, requiring isolation for the next 300 years. But who paid the human cost? The public court cases that followed were a masterclass in institutional gaslighting and class protection. The 3 wealthy doctors who owned the clinic were put on trial. The charge, criminal neglect, causing death and injury. Their defense team used every corporate loophole in the book. They argued that the NNEC was responsible for tracking the material. The commission blamed the State Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health blamed the local municipality. It was a circular firing squad of bureaucratic paperwork designed to ensure that no single elite took the fall. The conclusion of the legal saga? The doctors were ultimately acquitted of criminal prison sentences. Instead, the court ordered them to pay a measly fine of roughly $24,000. Think about the maths. A 6-year-old girl is dead and the entire community's health is permanently ruined. A city is contaminated for 3 centuries, and the legal system's price for total destruction is $24,000 in 0 jail time. This case exposes the absolute core of corruption of our political infrastructures. Our world leaders love to design complex safety frameworks, but those frameworks are only enforced to protect the investments of the rich. When a corporate or a private institution dumps its lethal waste into the doorstep of the poor, the legal system reclassifies a corporate execution as a bizarre accident and lets the murderers walk away clean. The anomaly is a permanent reminder of our current political status quo. The law does not exist to protect human lives. It exists to price them out as disposable collateral damage. Today, wealthy nations ship millions of tons of toxic electronic waste and fast fashion mountains to shores of Ghana, Chile, Bangladesh. And just like the 1987 scavengers, the locals burn and dismantle this waste to survive, hailing lethal chemicals every single day. The files are public record, but the system keeps the truth buried under concrete. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Blxck Archive. I hope this deep dive forced you to really see the system for what it truly is. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who's still looking at the wrong side of the border. Keep your eyes open, watch the lines of power. Never trust in a system that values administrative signatures over an innocent life. Anyways, that was the Blxck Archive. Stay sharp, stay questioning, and I will see you in the next file.